Welcome to Catching Genocide. In this podcast, we will discuss the Guatemalan genocide and corresponding civil war, where the government and military forces waged a campaign of needless terror and violence against indigenous and leftist Mayan forces, resulting in over 200,000 deaths in the entirety of the war. Efraín Ríos Montt, the former president, was at the helm of this regime, confronted with some of the worst atrocities committed, including mass killings and torture. In 2013, the former president was found guilty of genocide and crimes against humanity, an historical ruling, in no part due to the fact of forensic evidence playing a key role in gathering enough evidence to prove his culpability and guilt in these crimes. Through understanding the scale of these atrocities, we can understand how this genocide unfolded and the key role that forensic science played in this case. Welcome to Catching Genocide. Stage 1. Overview. José Efraín Ríos Montt, born June 16, 1926, was a former military leader and president of Guatemala. After serving a long military career, he launched a coup alongside two other military officers in 1982, which led to their ascension to power. Ríos Montt led the military junta that ruled Guatemala between March 23rd of 1982 and August 8th of 1983. During the infamous Guatemalan Civil War, he ruled for about 17 months before being overthrown himself. During that time period, he was at the forefront of military command against Marxist and leftist guerrilla rebels that were terrorizing Guatemala. During his leadership, Ríos Montt escalated the conflict against the guerrilla and leftist rebels, and in the process, helped wage complicit genocidal warfare against innocent local indigenous populations, eradicating and murdering many who got in his way. This added to the estimated death toll of over 200,000 Guatemalans killed during the entire Guatemalan Civil War, lasting from the 60s all the way up into the 90s. Ríos Montt's regime was marked by some of the worst atrocities committed in the country's history, including mass killings and torture. His government was also responsible for the forced disappearance of thousands of individuals and the displacement of hundreds of thousands of refugees fleeing from the conflict. Stage 2. A nation under fire. To understand the scale of these atrocities, we must also understand the underlying political and cultural history of Guatemala. The country itself has a complex history, marked by colonialization, imperialism, and exploitation. With a large indigenous population who makes up a large, significant minority who have been long oppressed and marginalized since the rule of Spain. From its times as a Mayan state to its Guatemalan heritage as a Spanish colony, Guatemala has been rife with instability and local conflicts. The Guatemalan Civil War, an afterburst of the Cold War, and was a manifestation of these underlying tensions and conflicts. The conflict was primarily fought between the government's centralist conservative forces and the leftist communist guerrilla groups, with the indigenous population caught in the middle of the crossfire. The war resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands and the displacement of millions of people in Guatemala. The rule of Ríos Montt's brutal regime and the tactics used to scorched earth policies were not solely unique to him, but were part of a broader issue of authoritarianism and government intervention and centralism in Guatemala. The country had a long history of political instability and violence, partly due to the legacy of Spanish colonial rule, and exacerbated by American fruit companies' influence and intervention in the country's politics by promoting dictatorships over democracies. To better understand this, we must crucially understand our main suspect, that of Ríos Montt, the life he lived, and the influence he had over the Guatemalan state. Stage 3. Rise to Terror. To provide some background information on our key subject, that of José Efraín Ríos Montt, and its research collected from Encyclopedia Britannica, here is as follows. The former president was born on June 16, 1926, and adulthood he decided to join the Guatemalan Armed Forces. In his decision to join the Guatemalan Armed Forces, he began his lengthy journey as a career military officer and his eventual path to the presidency, de facto military dictatorship since the rule and influence of the banana companies. In his lengthy military career, he rose the conservative, rigid, and traditional military ranks, and eventually reached the rank of brigadier general, not before building lengthy connections with other military officers and establishing his rule as a traditional military leader of Guatemala. His first step into political power would be in 1974, as he represented the Christian Democrat Party, which he subsequently lost the election that was largely seen as rigged to the incumbent dictator. However, in the year of 1982, Guatemalan politics would change greatly, as it was in this year that a group of young military officers, angered at the fact of the crippling situation in Guatemala, where the civil war against leftist forces stagnant, overthrew the government of General Romeo Lucas Garcia, the incumbent dictator of Guatemala. And rather surprisingly, even to the surprise of General Montt himself, he was installed as a leader alongside two co-junta members as the leaders of Guatemala. Those two co-junta members of General Horacio Maladona and Colonel Luis Martinez were all together the key founding leaders of Guatemala. This effectively cements General Montt and his rather meteoric rise to power in Guatemala, as it is through the crippling state of the nation that his genocidal policies would have free rein. Leading a government of primarily ultra-conservative military officials, General Montt was forced to confront the ever-increasing threat of communist leftist rebel troops, and to secure the nation as he enforced an ever-increasing repressive state. By this time, the long and arduous Guatemalan Civil War, the communist leftist forces, primarily concentrated in the jungles of the West and other provincial regional departments, were growing rapidly, with support being given by other communist military forces, primarily from Cuba and Nicaragua. As despite government prosecution, this coalition of various communist forces were by no means heroes or good in their own right, as they too waged needless and brutal campaigns of violence against the innocent and those they perceived unloyal to their ideology in the regions that they controlled. However, as a result of increasing tensions between the government and these communist forces in the various provinces that the Maya people inhabited, President Montt introduced a rather crude and ill-prepared plan to deal with these communist rebels and the Maya peoples at the same time. This ill-fated plan will be known officially as Fusiles y Frijoles, or as otherwise known in English, beans and bullets. In research collected for the Center of Justice and Accountability, this program in theory would arm local villagers with weapons and resources to curb the presence of leftist guerrilla forces in the remote villages. However, in practice, it would be a disaster. However, in actuality, the villagers will be actually supplied with ineffective weapons and would never get other supplies from the Allied government, as a result of which villagers were left to undefended and defenseless to protect themselves from both guerrilla forces and governmental forces, and simply a target, collateral damage from the ongoing civil war. However, it is in the situation of this that the horrific crimes of the regime make themselves known to the fullest, those being the government persecution and scorched earth policy towards the Maya people. Stage 4. War Crimes. In the early morning hour, the soft crunch of leaves and brush can be heard faintly in the jungle. The faint shimmer of a flashlight can be seen, and unidentifiable figures moved closer as they began to holler, bark orders to the villagers, and in short notice start forcibly gathering people outside of their homes in the dead of night to the center of the village. The unidentifiable soldiers, looking more like leftist forces, began to bark and yell in the early morning hours to their recently awakened Mayan villagers, and then verbally accuse them of being communist guerrilla sympathizers. A murmur can be heard, with a faint yet recognizable static, which of that of a radio transmission, and after military officers receive orders from his radio, he instructs the soldiers to kill and get rid of the so-called leftist guerrillas. The group, largely consisting of mothers, little children, were brutally beaten and tortured, with survivors being shot at with rifles, riddling their bodies with bullets. The extent of the horrendous crimes would only be discovered later by some survivors. In all, 250 men, women, and children were brutally murdered at this village by a group of military forces. The situation which I have just described was a horrendous and vile attack at the Mayan village of Dos Eres, a massacre that will be later described as one of the worst and most horrific governmental attacks that occurred on the orders of the military government headed by Efraín Ríos Montt. As an evidence collected from the Washington office in Latin America, it points to the continuation of war crimes in the administration of President Montt from the various previous dictatorships. These attacks have been occurring under other various dictatorships during the Guatemalan Civil War, and in evidence from the Open Societies Foundation, the delusional presidency of Efraín Ríos Montt planned to end the long Civil War and rid the nation of long-standing communist influence, and launched a plan to eliminate and exterminate any communist sympathizer. In released documents from the National Security Archive at George Washington University, declassified documents outline the premeditated and planned military operations to rid the country of the peoples who will be known as Operation Sophia as a part of the overall strategy of President Montt with Victoria 82. As within the 300-plus PDF chock full of logistics and other documents, the National Security Archive illustrates a premeditated plan to exterminate the so-called guerrilla sympathizers. And it was in this state of government, sanctioned genocide, that the full crimes of the President Montt regime was on full display. As journalists, most notably from PBS News, were on scene to record the horrific crimes, and the video would play all around the world, covering the smoldering villages and charred children. All whilst President Ronald Reagan of the United States would explicitly continue to support the regime of President Montt. However, this unleashing of pure chaos, not only in the regional departments of Guatemala, caused chaos arising in the heart of Guatemala, and of Guatemala City. This eventually led many to now rethink the presidency of Efraín Ríos Montt, including those within his own junta. Following multiple attempts in his rule, President Montt began to consolidate power and promote those loyal to him. The military began to scheme to overthrow his rule that they viewed negatively, not due to the warring state or the genocide, but rather personal interests on behalf of his cabinet. As with the deterioration of the Guatemalan state, his cabinet plotted against him. And on a fateful afternoon, on August 8th of 1983, President Montt's own defense minister, the General Oscar Mejia Victores, successfully overthrew the president in a coup d'etat. However, justice would not catch up to him so fast, as even after his regime collapsed, the former president would have to live his life as normally, and even continue to re-enter politics for 1 month. As despite his heinous crimes, he was still popular for his law and order force, and continued to be a leading figure of Guatemalan conservative politics. After entering politics as a member of the Guatemalan Congress, Montt entered a period of security as he served as a leader in the Guatemalan Congress, whilst enjoying the full benefit of immunity due to his positioning of the Congress. However, when his term ended, in a largely unexpected twist, the former president of Guatemala was going to be put on trial for war crimes and crimes against humanity for the crimes all those years past. Stage 5. Trial and Forensics. In this time of instability, his trial began on short notice. He initially was being charged with the crimes of war crimes and crimes against humanity due to his actions against some indigenous people almost 30 plus years ago. The trial itself was full of havoc, as politics, not justice, was the main priority. The trial, and then further subsequent retrials of the former president, would go on back and forth due to the long-standing influence the former president had within Guatemala's government, notably within the halls of justice themselves. However, in his trial, what would convict him of war crimes and crimes against humanity would be the key role that forensics played, as it would tie his orders and his troops to the actions in those villages. Forensic experts were able to use a variety of techniques to identify the remains of the victims, including DNA testing and forensic anthropology. The remains were exhumed from mass graves that have been discovered in the indigenous communities throughout the country. The experts were able to identify the victims based on their physical characteristics, such as height, age, and gender from the skeletal remains, as well as clothing and personal belonging fibers found within the sites. As forensic evidence was crucial in establishing the government's culpability for the genocide. In evidence from the Human Rights Watch organization, the prosecution was able to present evidence that the military had targeted specific indigenous communities, and that the victims had been subjugated to torture, murder, and violence before their death. The forensic evidence also helped establish the scale of the genocide, which had been previously difficult to quantify. One of the most important pieces of evidence was the physical skeletal evidence, as forensic experts such as from the Guatemalan Foundation for Anthropology were able to use the bones to identify the victims based on physical characteristics. The forensic team was able to use evidence to determine cause of death, such as ballistics and skeletal reconstruction found in mass graves. As many victims, such as those in the Dos Eres massacre, were able to be exhumed and found that they had been brutally beaten and horrendously riddled with bullets, blunt force trauma, and signs of force and torture on the skeletal remains. Forensic experts used DNA evidence as a key technique to involve the remains with the family members and relatives, as they gave DNA evidence to help confirm the identities of the victims and link the remains back to their families. Ballistic evidence from bullet casings were not only able to tie in weapons to the scene of the crime, but also able to link specific units and weapons involved to the vile acts of violence. Considering all this evidence, his trial and various retrials were not without serious attempts to convict him for these heinous crimes. And on May 10th of 2013, the former president and military commander of Guatemala was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and the overwhelming forensic evidence was a large part of his conviction. Stage 5. The trial's legacy and conclusion. However, his story does not end here. In an attempt by the higher courts, his convictions were overturned. Yet, in a few years after his trial returning, a trial was called again to continue to pursue justice. Before his retrial could commence, the former president of Guatemala would die on April 1st of 2018, and his trial was subsequently dropped. In all, the Guatemalan genocide, whilst under the presidency of Efraín Ríos Montt, was a horrific period in the nation of Guatemala's history, marked by widespread violence, atrocities, and human rights abuses. However, in the pursuit of justice, forensic science was able to convict the former head of state for his crimes all those years ago, and the trial was a continuing reminder of the devastating political violence that consumed the world in the so-called Cold War, and the importance of forensic science in justice. Thank you for listening to this podcast on the Guatemalan genocide, the trial of former President Efraín Ríos Montt, and the forensic science that was able to piece together the chaos that enveloped Guatemala during the Civil War. And thank you for your time. This is Catching the Genocide.